The silence was deafening. 28,000 spectators sat frozen in their seats as the dust settled in the arena of Frontier Park. Just seconds before, the crowd had been roaring with excitement, cowbells clanging and voices cheering. Now an eerie quiet blanketed the entire stadium like a heavy fog rolling across the Wyoming plains. Jake Morrison lay motionless against the steel rails, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. The red dirt beneath him was already darkening with blood. 8 feet away, Red Thunder, a 1,800-pound Brahma bull with a reputation for sending riders to the hospital, snorted and pawed the ground, his massive frame still trembling with adrenaline. The beast's eyes, wild and unfocused, seemed to understand that something terrible had just happened. Dr. Sarah Chin was among the first to reach Jake. As the head of the medical team for Cheyenne Frontier Days, she had seen her share of injuries over the years: broken ribs, concussions, torn ligaments. But as she knelt beside the young cowboy from Texas, her experienced hands immediately detected the gravity of the situation. Jake's breathing was shallow and irregular, his pulse weak. When she checked his pupils with her penlight, only one responded. "We need a helicopter. Now!" she shouted to her team, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Spinal trauma, possible traumatic brain injury. Get me a backboard and a cervical collar." The rodeo announcer, Mike Daniels, had been calling rodeos for over 20 years. His voice had narrated thousands of rides, celebrated countless victories, and consoled audiences through minor injuries. But as he stared down at the scene unfolding in the arena, words failed him completely. The microphone trembled in his weathered hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," he finally managed, his usually booming voice now barely a whisper that somehow carried through the stadium's sound system. "Please remain in your seats while our medical team attends to the rider." In the stands, Jake's girlfriend, Emma Rodriguez, pushed through the crowd with desperate determination. They had been together for 3 years, and she had watched him ride hundreds of bulls. She knew the risks, they all did. But seeing him lying there so still, so vulnerable, made those abstract dangers brutally real. "That's my boyfriend," she screamed at the security guards who tried to prevent her from jumping over the rail. "I'm a nurse. I need to get down there." The guards, recognizing the genuine anguish in her voice and her medical credentials, reluctantly allowed her passage. As she ran across the arena, her nursing training kicked in, though her heart was breaking with every step. Red Thunder had been corralled by the pickup riders, but the bull seemed reluctant to leave the arena. The massive animal kept looking back toward where Jake lay, as if sensing the weight of what had just occurred. Ranch hands who had worked with the bull for years had never seen him behave this way before. The medical team worked with practiced efficiency, but the severity of Jake's injuries was becoming increasingly apparent. His left leg was clearly broken, bent at a sickening angle below the knee. More concerning was his lack of response to verbal commands and the irregular breathing pattern that suggested possible brain trauma. "Jake, can you hear me?" Dr. Chin called out as they carefully secured him to the backboard. "Jake, if you can hear me, try to squeeze my hand." Nothing. His calloused hand, which had gripped countless rope handles and weathered countless storms, lay limp in hers. The life flight helicopter arrived within minutes, its rotors whipping the arena dirt into small tornadoes. The pilot, Captain Rodriguez, no relation to Emma, had flown emergency missions throughout Wyoming for over a decade. He had extracted injured hikers from remote mountain locations, rushed heart attack victims from rural communities to Denver hospitals, and transported accident victims from highway crashes. But there was something about this call that felt different. As the medical team loaded Jake into the helicopter, Emma was allowed to accompany him. She held his hand throughout the flight to Denver Health Medical Center, whispering prayers, promises, and memories of their life together. The monitors showed vital signs that fluctuated between stable and critical, an electronic rhythm that would haunt her dreams for months to come. Below them, the lights of Denver grew larger as they approached the trauma center. Dr. Chun continued to monitor Jake's condition, making notes that would be crucial for the neurosurgical team waiting at the hospital. Every detail mattered now: the exact nature of the impact, the duration of unconsciousness, the progression of symptoms during transport. "ETA 2 minutes, Captain Rodriguez announced through the intercom. "Trauma team is standing by." At Frontier Park, the rodeo had been suspended indefinitely. The other contestants, men and women who made their living riding bulls, broncs, and competing in various events, gathered in small groups, their usual bravado replaced by quiet concern. They all knew Jake Morrison. He was respected in the circuit, not just for his riding ability, but for his character. He was the kind of guy who would lend money to a competitor down on his luck, who would stay up all night helping someone trailer a horse with colic, who would give his last beer to a friend after a hard day. Tommy Brennan, a fellow bull rider from Montana, stood with his arms crossed, staring at the empty arena. "I've seen Jake ride bulls that would send most of us to the emergency room," he said to anyone within earshot. "If Red Thunder could do this to him, that bull's a killer." But Red Thunder wasn't a killer, not by nature. Bulls like him were athletes in their own right, bred and trained for the specific purpose of testing the skills of the world's best riders. They were valuable animals, cared for by teams of veterinarians and handlers who understood their temperaments and needs. What had happened today was the convergence of countless variables: timing, physics, instinct, and pure bad luck. As news of the accident spread beyond the rodeo grounds, social media exploded with videos taken by spectators. The footage was graphic and disturbing, showing the exact moment when Red Thunder's powerful hindquarters launched Jake Morrison through the air like a rag doll. The impact against the steel rails was sickening to watch, and many of the videos were quickly taken down by the platforms for violating content policies. But the damage was done. Within hours, the hashtag Cheyenne tragedy was trending nationwide, with millions of views and thousands of comments ranging from prayers for Jake's recovery to debates about the ethics of rodeo as a sport. Animal rights activists seized on the incident as proof that rodeo was inherently cruel and dangerous, while rodeo defenders argued that accidents, though tragic, were part of the sport's inherent risks. At Denver Health Medical Center, Jake was rushed into emergency surgery. Dr. Michael Torres, the chief of neurosurgery, had performed thousands of operations, but the scan results from Jake's initial imaging were sobering. There was significant swelling in the brain, and the impact had caused multiple fractures to his skull. The next several hours would be critical in determining not just whether Jake would survive, but what kind of life he might have if he did. Emma sat in the surgical waiting room, surrounded by Jake's family who had driven through the night from Texas. His parents, Jim and Mary Morrison, were salt-of-the-earth ranchers who had raised their son to be tough, independent, and respectful. They had always supported his rodeo career, even though they worried constantly about his safety. "He's strong," Mary Morrison said, more to herself than to anyone else. "He's always been strong." As the sun set over the Denver skyline, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, the waiting continued. In Operating Room 3, Dr. Torres and his team worked methodically to relieve the pressure on Jake's brain and repair the damage caused by the impact. Every minute mattered. Every decision could mean the difference between recovery and permanent disability. Back in Cheyenne, the Frontier Days Committee held an emergency meeting to discuss the future of the festival. The remaining events had been canceled for the day, but thousands of visitors were still in town, many of whom had traveled from around the world to attend the famous rodeo. The economic impact of canceling the entire festival would be devastating for the local community, but the committee also understood that proceeding as if nothing had happened would be seen as callous and insensitive. Chairman Robert Hayes, a third-generation Cheyenne resident whose grandfather had helped found the modern version of Frontier Days, faced the most difficult decision of his tenure. "We need to balance respect for Jake Morrison and his family with our responsibility to the thousands of people who depend on this event for their livelihood," he told the assembled committee members. If this story has already moved you, subscribe to the channel and leave your like so you don't miss any of our stories. 3 months before the accident that would change everything, Jake Morrison was living his dream. The spring rodeo season had been his best yet, with consistent finishes in the top 10 at major events across the country. He had qualified for the National Finals Rodeo in Las Vegas for the third consecutive year, and for the first time in his career, he was sitting in the top 5 in the world standings. Growing up on a small ranch outside of Amarillo, Texas, Jake had been around cattle and horses his entire life. His father, Jim Morrison, had competed in local rodeos during his younger years before settling down to run the family ranch. Jim had hoped his son would choose a more stable career path, perhaps taking over the ranch operations or pursuing a degree in agriculture or veterinary medicine. But Jake had been drawn to the arena from an early age. At 12, he was riding steers at junior rodeos. By 16, he was competing against grown men at amateur events throughout Texas and Oklahoma. His natural ability was undeniable. He had the balance of a gymnast, the reflexes of a race car driver, and most importantly, the fearlessness that separated good bull riders from great ones. Emma Rodriguez had entered Jake's life 3 years earlier at a rodeo in San Antonio. She was working as a trauma nurse at University Hospital and had volunteered to provide medical coverage for the event. When Jake was bucked off a particularly ornery bull named Tornado Alley and hit the ground hard, Emma was the first medical professional to reach him. "Can you tell me your name?" she had asked, checking his pupils for signs of concussion. "Jake Morrison," he had replied, though he was obviously dazed. "And you're the prettiest medic I've ever seen." Despite his flirtation during a medical evaluation, Emma had been impressed by his toughness and good humor. When he asked her out for coffee after she cleared him to continue competing, she surprised herself by saying yes. 3 years later, they were talking about marriage and the possibility of Jake retiring from professional rodeo to start a family. But first, Jake wanted one more shot at the World Championship. At 28, he was approaching the age when most bull riders began to consider retirement. The body could only take so much punishment, and younger competitors were always coming up through the ranks. This was his window, his moment to achieve the goal he had worked toward his entire adult life. Training for the 2025 season had been more intense than ever. Jake spent hours in the gym working on his core strength and flexibility. He practiced on mechanical bulls, adjusting the settings to simulate the movements of specific bulls he would face during the season. He studied video footage of his rides, analyzing his technique and identifying areas for improvement. Most importantly, he worked with a sports psychologist to develop the mental toughness required to perform at the highest level. Dr. Amanda Walsh specialized in working with extreme athletes, rock climbers, motorcycle racers, mixed martial arts fighters, individuals who regularly faced the possibility of serious injury or death in pursuit of their goals. "Fear is natural," Dr. Walsh had told Jake during one of their sessions. "The goal isn't to eliminate fear, but to function effectively despite it. The bulls can sense your emotions. If you're tentative or hesitant, they'll exploit that weakness." Jake had always been naturally confident, but the psychological work helped him develop a more systematic approach to managing the stress and pressure of competition. He learned breathing techniques to control his heart rate during the intense moments before a ride. He practiced visualization exercises, mentally rehearsing successful rides on specific bulls. Red Thunder had been on Jake's radar for over a year. The massive Brahma bull had developed a reputation as one of the most challenging draws in professional rodeo. In 37 attempts, only 6 riders had managed to stay on Red Thunder for the required 8 seconds, and several of those rides had been marginal at best. The bull had a particular tendency to spin to the left before launching into a series of bone-jarring bucks that had sent countless riders flying. But Jake wasn't intimidated by Red Thunder's reputation. In fact, he was excited about the opportunity to ride such a prestigious bull at Cheyenne Frontier Days. A successful ride on Red Thunder at the world's largest outdoor rodeo would be a significant boost to his world standings and his chances of winning the year-end championship. The week before Cheyenne, Jake had been staying at the ranch of his mentor, Bobby Martinez, a former world champion who now worked as a stock contractor and coach. Bobby had won the world title twice in the 1990s before a severe back injury forced his retirement. He had taken Jake under his wing early in the young rider's career, providing guidance both in technical aspects of bull riding and in navigating the business side of professional rodeo. "Red Thunder's not just big," Bobby had told Jake as they watched video footage of the bull's recent performances. "He's smart. He'll try to set you up, make you think you've got him figured out, then hit you with something unexpected. You've got to stay one step ahead of him mentally." They had spent hours analyzing Red Thunder's patterns, identifying the subtle signs that preceded his most dangerous moves. The bull had a habit of dropping his shoulder slightly before spinning, and he tended to buck higher when riders were positioned further forward on his back. Small details, but potentially crucial information that could mean the difference between a successful ride and disaster. Emma had mixed feelings about Jake's career as their relationship became more serious. She understood his passion for rodeo and respected his dedication to achieving his goals, but her experience as a trauma nurse made her acutely aware of how quickly lives could change due to a moment's bad luck. She had treated too many young men whose dreams had ended in emergency rooms, whose promising futures had been derailed by spinal cord injuries, traumatic brain injuries, and other catastrophic trauma. "I know you love this," she had told Jake one evening as they sat on the porch of his family's ranch, watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "And I love watching you do what you're passionate about. But I also worry about what happens if something goes wrong. Jake had understood her concerns, but he also felt he was approaching the peak of his career. He was riding better than ever, his confidence was high, and he genuinely believed he could win the world championship. After that, he was open to discussing retirement and starting the next chapter of their lives together. The drive to Cheyenne had been filled with anticipation and excitement. Jake's parents had decided to make the trip, along with Emma and several friends from Texas. They had rented an RV and planned to make a vacation out of the week-long festival. For the Morrison family, this represented the culmination of years of sacrifice and support for Jake's career. The expenses associated with professional rodeo were substantial. Entry fees, travel costs, equipment, and medical insurance added up quickly. Jake's parents had mortgaged their ranch to help fund his early career, betting everything on their son's talent and determination. Now, with Jake sitting fifth in the world standings and earning significant prize money, those investments were finally paying off. Cheyenne Frontier Days held special significance in the rodeo world. Established in 1897, it was the oldest and largest outdoor rodeo in the world, attracting competitors and spectators from around the globe. Winning at Cheyenne was a career-defining achievement that would be remembered long after other victories were forgotten. The city of Cheyenne itself was transformed during the festival. Hotels were booked solid for months in advance. Restaurants struggled to keep up with demand. The local airport saw a dramatic increase in private jet traffic as wealthy rodeo enthusiasts flew in for the week-long celebration of Western heritage and culture. Main Street became a pedestrian mall lined with vendors selling everything from handmade leather goods to gourmet barbecue. Live music echoed from multiple stages, and the smell of funnel cakes and grilled onions filled the air. For many visitors, especially those from urban areas, Frontier Days offered a glimpse into a lifestyle and set of values that seemed increasingly rare in modern America. Jake had competed at Cheyenne twice before, with mixed results. In 2023, he had drawn a relatively easy bull and managed a score of 86 points, good enough for a check, but not a podium finish. In 2024, he had been bucked off in less than 3 seconds by a bull named Wicked Intentions, earning no score and no prize money. This year felt different. Jake's preparation had been more thorough, his physical conditioning was better than ever, and his mental approach was more mature and focused. When the draw was announced, and he learned he would be riding Red Thunder, he felt a surge of excitement rather than apprehension. "This is it," he had told Emma that evening as they walked around the rodeo grounds, taking in the sights and sounds of the festival. "This is my shot at something special." The night before his scheduled ride, Jake had slept better than usual. Often, he would lie awake before big competitions, his mind racing through various scenarios and possibilities. But that night in Cheyenne, he felt calm and confident. He had done everything possible to prepare, and now it was simply a matter of executing when the moment arrived. He woke up early and went through his usual pre-competition routine. First, a light breakfast, nothing too heavy that might affect his balance or agility. Then, 45 minutes of stretching and light exercise to ensure his body was loose and ready. Finally, 30 minutes of mental preparation, visualizing successful rides and positive outcomes. As he walked toward the arena for the final time, Jake felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. Regardless of what happened in the next 8 seconds, he had lived his dream and pushed himself to the limits of his abilities. He had no way of knowing that in less than an hour, everything would change forever. The trauma bay at Denver Health Medical Center had seen its share of life-and-death emergencies, but the intensity surrounding Jake Morrison's arrival was palpable. Dr. Michael Torres emerged from the operating room after 7 hours of surgery, his scrubs stained with sweat and exhaustion etched across his face. The waiting room fell silent as Emma, Jake's parents, and several close friends looked up with desperate hope in their eyes. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," Dr. Torres began, choosing his words carefully. "We were able to relieve the pressure on his brain and repair the skull fractures. However, Jake suffered what we classify as a severe traumatic brain injury. The next 48 to 72 hours will be critical in determining the extent of the damage." Mary Morrison gripped her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Will he be okay?" Dr. Torres had delivered this type of news hundreds of times, but it never became easier. "Mrs. Morrison, your son is fighting for his life. Brain injuries are unpredictable. Some patients make remarkable recoveries, while others face long-term challenges. We need to take this one day at a time." Emma felt the floor beneath her feet become unsteady. As a nurse, she understood the medical terminology and the gravity of what Dr. Torres was telling them. Severe traumatic brain injury could mean anything from temporary cognitive impairment to permanent disability. The Jake she knew, quick-witted, fearless, full of life, might never be the same person again. In the intensive care unit, Jake lay connected to a web of monitors and life support equipment. A ventilator breathed for him, while IVs delivered medications to control brain swelling and prevent seizures. His head was wrapped in bandages, and his left leg was immobilized in a cast from hip to ankle. The strong, confident athlete who had walked into the arena just hours earlier was now completely dependent on machines and medical intervention. Emma took his hand, careful not to disturb the 4 lines. "I'm here, Jake," she whispered. "We're all here. You just need to focus on getting better." The monitors beeped steadily, the only sounds in a room that felt suspended between hope and despair. Emma had sat bedside with many patients during her nursing career, but this was different. This was personal. This was the man she loved, reduced to vital signs and medical charts. Back in Cheyenne, the rodeo community was grappling with the aftermath of the accident. The decision had been made to continue with the remaining events after a day of suspension, but the atmosphere was subdued. Competitors went through the motions of their routines, but their hearts weren't fully in it. Every time a bull rider entered the arena, spectators held their breath a little longer. Red Thunder had been retired immediately following the incident. The decision wasn't made lightly. The bull was valuable, and retiring him represented a significant financial loss for the stock contractor. But everyone involved understood that Red Thunder's career was over. No one would ever ride him again. Tom Bradley, the stock contractor who owned Red Thunder, stood in the bull's pen, watching the massive animal eat hay as if nothing had happened. Bulls, unlike humans, didn't dwell on past events. Red Thunder had no understanding of the trauma he had caused or the life he had potentially destroyed. 30 years I've been in this business, Tom said to his ranch foreman, Pete Williams. I've seen bulls hurt riders before, but never like this. Maybe it's time to start thinking about retiring some of these older, more aggressive bulls before something like this happens again. The rodeo industry was facing difficult questions in the wake of Jake's accident. Animal rights groups, which had long criticized rodeo as cruel to animals, now pointed to the incident as evidence that the sport was also unnecessarily dangerous for human participants. Social media was flooded with calls to ban professional bull riding, while defenders of the sport argued that participants understood and accepted the risks. Dr. Amanda Walsh, the sports psychologist who had worked with Jake, felt a profound sense of responsibility. She had helped him overcome his fears and develop the confidence to ride the most dangerous bulls in the world. Now she wondered if she had contributed to putting him in harm's way. Athletes in extreme sports understand the risks intellectually, she explained to a colleague. But there's always a part of them that believes they're invincible, that serious injury happens to other people. Maybe that's what allows them to perform at such a high level, but it also makes them vulnerable to exactly this type of tragedy. Emma rarely left Jake's bedside during those first critical days. She took leave from her job and essentially moved into the hospital. Other nurses on the unit, understanding her situation, quietly ensured she had access to shower facilities and meal vouchers. The ICU staff had seen family members maintain these bedside vigils before, and they knew how important it was for patients to have loved ones nearby. On the 3rd day, Jake began showing signs of responsiveness. His eyes would occasionally flutter open, though he didn't seem to focus on anything in particular. When Dr. Torres tested his reflexes, Jake's hands would sometimes squeeze in response to commands, though inconsistently. These are encouraging signs, Dr. Torres told Emma. Brain injury recovery often happens in small increments. What seems insignificant to you might actually represent meaningful progress. Emma documented every slight improvement in a journal she had started keeping. Jake's eyelids staying open for longer periods. A slight movement of his fingers when she spoke to him. The ventilator settings being reduced as his breathing improved. Small victories that meant everything to those who loved him. Jake's hospital room became a gathering place for the rodeo community. Competitors, stock contractors, and officials made pilgrimages to Denver to pay their respects. The small room was filled with flowers, cards, and get-well wishes from around the world. The Professional Bull Riders Organization established a fund to help with medical expenses, and within a week, over $300,000 had been donated. Tommy Brennan, Jake's fellow competitor and friend, struggled with survivor's guilt. "I've ridden Red Thunder twice," he told Emma during one of his visits. "Both times I got lucky. 8 seconds and off. I keep thinking, why Jake? Why not me?" Emma appreciated the support, but she also found herself becoming protective of Jake's privacy. Well-meaning visitors would sometimes make insensitive comments about his appearance or prognosis. She learned to diplomatically limit visiting hours and screen who was allowed into the room. Dr. Sarah Chun, the Rodeo medical director who had been first on scene, visited Jake several times during his hospitalization. She felt a professional responsibility to follow up on the patients she treated, but this case had affected her more deeply than most. "I keep replaying those first few minutes," she told Emma, "wondering if I could have done something different, something better. In emergency medicine, you learn that you can't save everyone, but that doesn't make cases like this any easier." Emma reassured her that she had done everything possible under the circumstances, but she understood the burden Dr. Chin was carrying. In medicine, the cases that stayed with you were often the ones where good care wasn't enough to prevent a tragic outcome. As days turned into weeks, Jake's condition gradually improved, though progress was frustratingly slow. He was weaned off the ventilator and began breathing on his own. His periods of consciousness became longer and more frequent. Most encouragingly, he began responding to his name and following simple commands. But significant challenges remained. Jake's speech was slurred and difficult to understand. His memory was severely impaired. He couldn't remember the accident, and his recollection of events from before the injury was spotty and inconsistent. Simple tasks that had once been automatic, like eating or walking, would require extensive rehabilitation. The conversations about Jake's future became increasingly difficult. Dr. Torres was optimistic about his survival, but realistic about the long road ahead. "Jake will likely need months, possibly years, of intensive rehabilitation," he explained to the family. "Some of his cognitive and physical abilities may return, but others may not. We need to prepare for the possibility that he may never be the same person he was before the accident." For Emma, this prognosis was both devastating and hopeful. The man she loved was alive, and there was potential for recovery. But the Jake Morrison who had walked into that arena, confident, articulate, physically capable, might be gone forever. The financial implications were staggering. Jake's insurance would cover the initial emergency treatment, but long-term rehabilitation costs could easily reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. The ranch his parents had mortgaged to support his career was at risk, and Emma's nursing salary wouldn't be sufficient to cover the ongoing expenses. But the rodeo community rallied around the Morrison family in ways that surprised even longtime participants in the sport. Benefit events were organized across the country. Fellow competitors donated prize money from their own victories. Local businesses in Cheyenne contributed a portion of their Frontier Days profits to Jake's medical fund. Bobby Martinez, Jake's mentor, took on the responsibility of coordinating much of the fundraising effort. "Jake would do the same for any of us," he said simply. "That's just the kind of person he is. Now it's our turn to take care of him." As Jake's consciousness improved, he began to understand the severity of his situation. The realization that his rodeo career was over hit him with devastating force. During one particularly difficult conversation with Emma, he broke down completely. "I can't even remember my own middle name half the time," he said, his words still slurred from the brain injury. "How am I supposed to take care of you? How am I supposed to be the man you fell in love with?" Emma held him as he cried, her own tears mixing with his. She had fallen in love with Jake's spirit, his determination, his kindness. Qualities that, while perhaps changed by his injury, were still fundamentally part of who he was. But she also understood his frustration and grief over the loss of his former self. The rehabilitation process would be long and uncertain, but Emma was committed to supporting Jake through whatever lay ahead. Their future looked dramatically different from what they had planned, but it was still their future to build together. As autumn arrived in Colorado, painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, Jake Morrison faced the most challenging ride of his life, the journey back to himself. 6 months after the accident, Jake Morrison sat in a wheelchair on the front porch of his family's ranch in Texas, watching the sun set over the pastures where he had once practiced roping and riding. The man who had traveled the country pursuing rodeo glory was now learning to walk again, one painstaking step at a time. The rehabilitation process had been longer and more difficult than anyone had anticipated. After 2 months in Denver Health Medical Center, Jake had been transferred to a specialized brain injury rehabilitation facility in Dallas. There, a team of physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech pathologists, and neuropsychologists worked with him daily to rebuild the neural pathways damaged in the accident. Progress came in small increments that required tremendous effort. Relearning to tie his shoes took 3 weeks. Forming complete sentences without losing his train of thought was still a daily struggle. The simplest tasks, buttoning a shirt, remembering a phone number, following a recipe, required intense concentration and often resulted in frustration when his damaged brain couldn't perform functions that had once been automatic. Emma had taken a position at a hospital in Dallas to be closer to Jake's rehabilitation facility. Their relationship had been tested in ways neither could have imagined. The confident, witty man she had fallen in love with was still there, but he was often buried beneath layers of confusion, fatigue, and depression. Some days, Jake didn't recognize her at all. Other days, he was angry and resentful about his condition, lashing out at the people trying to help him. Brain injury recovery isn't just about relearning physical skills, explained Dr. Jennifer Hayes, Jake's neuropsychologist. It's about grieving the loss of who you used to be and finding meaning in who you're becoming. For someone like Jake, whose entire identity was built around physical prowess and competition, this process is particularly challenging. The rodeo community had not forgotten Jake Morrison. Throughout his rehabilitation, he received a steady stream of visitors, cards, and messages of support. Professional bull riders had created a scholarship in his name for young riders pursuing college education. Several bulls had been retired in his honor, and a special ceremony was planned for the next Cheyenne Frontier Days to commemorate his career. But for Jake, these gestures were bittersweet reminders of a life he could no longer live. Watching rodeo on television was painful. Seeing other riders compete on bulls he had once dominated, knowing he would never again experience the rush of 8 seconds that had defined his existence for over a decade. Tommy Brennan visited regularly, often bringing news from the rodeo circuit. During one visit, he hesitantly mentioned that Red Thunder had been sold to a ranch in Montana, where the bull would live out his retirement in peaceful pastures. The information was meant to provide closure, but it only reminded Jake of how drastically his own life had changed. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had drawn a different bull that day," Jake said, his speech still slower and more deliberate than before the accident. "If I had just been bucked off clean and walked away like thousands of times before." Emma squeezed his hand. "We can't change what happened, Jake. We can only decide what we do next." The what next question haunted both of them. Jake's medical team was cautiously optimistic about his continued recovery, but realistic about his limitations. He would likely never regain the quick reflexes and perfect balance that had made him a world-class athlete. His short-term memory problems might improve, but would probably never fully resolve. The traumatic brain injury had fundamentally altered his neural architecture in ways that couldn't be undone. Financial pressures added another layer of stress to an already difficult situation. Despite the generous donations from the rodeo community, Jake's medical expenses had exceeded $400,000. His parents had been forced to sell a portion of their ranch to avoid foreclosure. Emma's nursing salary, while steady, wasn't sufficient to cover the ongoing costs of Jake's care and rehabilitation. During a family meeting with a financial counselor, the harsh realities became clear. "Jake will likely require some level of assistance for the rest of his life," the counselor explained. "Whether that's help with daily living activities, vocational rehabilitation, or ongoing medical care, these services are expensive and often not fully covered by insurance." Jim Morrison, Jake's father, felt the weight of helplessness that comes with watching your child suffer and being unable to fix the problem. "I'd trade places with him in a heartbeat," he told his wife Mary one evening as they walked around their reduced property. "That boy lived for rodeo, and now." Mary Morrison had always been the emotional anchor of the family, but Jake's accident had tested even her considerable strength. She had watched her son transform from a confident young man into someone who sometimes couldn't remember what he had eaten for breakfast. The grief was compounded by the uncertainty, not knowing how much of Jake's former self would ever return. As spring arrived in Texas, bringing wildflowers and renewed hope to the landscape, Jake began showing signs of more significant progress. His walking improved to the point where he could navigate short distances without assistance. His speech became clearer and more spontaneous. Most importantly, his periods of depression became less frequent and less severe. Dr. Hayes attributed much of this improvement to Jake's decision to begin working with other brain injury patients as a peer counselor. Sometimes the best therapy comes from helping others who are facing similar challenges, she explained. Jake's experience gives him credibility and empathy that professional counselors can't provide. Jake's work with other patients became a source of purpose and identity beyond his former career as a rodeo competitor. He discovered that his natural leadership abilities and competitive drive could be channeled into helping others overcome obstacles and achieve their rehabilitation goals. One patient in particular, a teenage girl named Ashley who had been injured in a car accident, responded strongly to Jake's encouragement. "You were famous," she said during one of their sessions. "You had everything and you lost it all. But you're still fighting. If you can do it, maybe I can too." Emma watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and melancholy. The Jake who was emerging from rehabilitation was different from the man she had fallen in love with, but he was still fundamentally good, still determined to make a positive impact on the world around him. Their relationship was evolving, but it was surviving. The question of marriage, which had been actively discussed before the accident, remained unresolved. Emma was committed to supporting Jake through his recovery, but both of them understood that their future together would look dramatically different from what they had originally planned. The possibility of children, of financial security, of growing old together. All of these dreams required reconsideration in light of Jake's limitations. As the first anniversary of the accident approached, plans were made for a memorial service at Cheyenne Frontier Days. Not a memorial for Jake, he was very much alive, but a ceremony to honor the end of his competitive career and to raise awareness about rodeo safety. The Professional Bull Riders Organization had implemented new safety protocols in response to Jake's accident. Enhanced medical coverage, improved arena design, and stricter equipment standards were all part of an effort to prevent similar tragedies. While these changes couldn't undo what had happened to Jake, they represented his lasting impact on the sport he loved. Dr. Sarah Chun, the medical director who had treated Jake immediately after the accident, had become an advocate for improved emergency medical protocols at rodeo events. "Jake Morrison's accident taught us that we can never be too prepared," she said in presentations to medical conferences. "Every second counts in these situations, and having the right equipment and training can mean the difference between life and death." Red Thunder, the bull responsible for the accident, had indeed been retired to a ranch in Montana. Contrary to popular perception, the bull hadn't been destroyed or mistreated in any way. Bulls, unlike humans, bore no emotional responsibility for accidents that occurred during competition. Red Thunder lived peacefully in large pastures, unaware of the human drama his actions had caused. Jake's decision to attend the memorial ceremony at Cheyenne was difficult but important. He wanted to face the arena where his life had changed, to find some form of closure, and to thank the community that had supported him throughout his recovery. The ceremony itself was emotionally overwhelming. Thousands of rodeo fans stood and applauded as Jake, walking slowly but steadily, made his way to the center of the arena. Emma walked beside him, her presence a source of strength and stability. When Jake spoke to the crowd, his words were simple but powerful. "I want to thank everyone who has been part of my journey, both before and after July 15th, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. "Rodeo gave me the best years of my life, and even though I can't compete anymore, this community has given me something even more valuable. The knowledge that when someone falls, there are always people willing to help them get back up." The crowd's response was thunderous, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. In the stands, other competitors wiped away tears, understanding both the tragedy and the triumph represented by Jake's presence in the arena. As Jake and Emma left Cheyenne that evening, driving through the Wyoming countryside toward an uncertain but hopeful future, they carried with them the support of a community that had rallied around them in their darkest hour. Jake would never again ride bulls for 8 seconds, but he had learned that there were different ways to measure a successful life. The cowboy who had once defined himself by his ability to conquer the most dangerous bulls in the world had discovered that true courage sometimes meant simply facing each new day with determination and grace. The accident had taken away his career, but it had revealed a strength of character that no injury could diminish. Emma reached over and took his hand as they drove through the gathering darkness. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Jake looked out at the vast landscape illuminated by stars, considering the question carefully. "I'm thinking about tomorrow," he said finally. "And the day after that. And all the days we get to figure out together." Behind them, the lights of Cheyenne faded into the distance, but ahead of them stretched the open road of possibility. Jake Morrison's riding career was over, but his life, changed, challenging, but still precious, continued. In a sport built on the idea of lasting 8 seconds, he had learned that the moments that truly matter are the ones that come after you've been thrown, when you pick yourself up and decide to keep going. The greatest tragedy at Cheyenne Frontier Days 2025 had become, through the power of human resilience and community support, a story of survival, adaptation, and hope. Not the ending anyone would have chosen, but perhaps, in its own way, a victory nonetheless.